Thank you, Sindhu, and good morning. On behalf of the Illinois Math and Science community and the city of Aurora, we welcome you to this historic occasion. I also want to give a special thank you to our friends in the private sector who, through their generous contributions, enable special events like this to be possible. Throughout the Academy's first decade, we have been honored to host a number of guest speakers whose lives have blazed new trails and inspired others to reach for the stars. Dr. Carl Sagan, Dr. Edward Teller, Ms. Maya Angelou, Dr. Sally Ride, Mr. Michael Singletary, and Dr. Jim Lovell are just a few examples. Today, continuing in that tradition, we are here to honor and learn from the life, courage, and contributions of a true national treasure. However, before I introduce Mrs. Rosa Parks, it is my pleasure to also introduce the distinguished members of our interview panel, Mr. Vernon Jarrett and Mr. Studs Terkel. Vernon Jarrett is one of our nation's foremost newspaper, television, and radio commentators on race relations, politics, urban affairs, and African American history. He is in his 27th year as a talk show host, producer, and commentator at WLS-TV Channel 7, and recently retired as a columnist and editorial board member at the Chicago Sun-Times. Mr. Jarrett is a professional scholar at the Freedoms Forum First Amendment Center at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. Through this center, he is completing a book of essays on crusading Black leaders who effectively use their constitutional rights to assemble, speak out, and publish their opinions during the turn of the century. Recently, he was one of the featured narrators on the BBC's production of The Promised Land, and he has also made guest appearances on Nightline, Meet the Press, 60 Minutes, and the McNeil-Lehrer Report. Mr. Jarrett has received more than 100 awards from professional, civic, religious, business, and educational institutions. He is a founder of the National Association of Black Journalists and has been awarded that organization's Medal of Honor and Lifetime Achievement Award. He has a special interest in the youth of this country, and one of his most laudable achievements is the creation of a group called ACT-SO, the African American Cultural, Technological, and Scientific Olympics. This program is designed to give young Black academic achievers the same recognition awarded to athletic stars. Please join me in welcoming our special guest, Mr. Vernon Jarrett. Of the second member of our interview panel, Modern Maturity Washington Bureau Chief Roy Hoops has written, "Studs is the kind of guy who can't drive, wears red check shirts and red socks," there they are, smokes cigars in his 80s, and is constantly waved onto the street but doesn't notice because he's too busy talking to himself. People probably wave to him so much because his favorite subject is the man on the street, and his favorite themes are universal: freedom, truth, and justice. Probably no one in history has talked extensively to more Americans than interviewer Louis Studs Terkel. A renowned author and radio and television personality, this gifted interviewer is known for his uncanny ability to engage people in rich and spontaneous dialogue. The 50s and 60s were very kaleidoscopic decades for Mr. Terkel. He wrote for the Sun-Times, starred in various stage productions, moderated panel discussions, lectured, and narrated documentary films. And it was during this time that he found his real niche, the literary form known as oral history. As you know, Mr. Terkel published his first book of interviews, Division Street, in 1967. Its success led to 6 other best-selling book of interviews, including Hard Times, The Good War, and his latest book. His interviews reveal character in a remarkable way and dramatize the antipathies of rich and poor, young and old, and black and white. Will you please join me in welcoming our very special guest, Studs Terkel. It is now an honor and personal privilege for me to introduce a woman whose life story is one of utmost courage, integrity, moral leadership, and hope. On a personal note, while there are many people whose contributions to the betterment of humanity I admire, there are only a handful of people who, for me, are true heroes, and sheroes, in the words of Maya Angelou. My mother, my father, my brother are three. Among the famous, Anwar Sadat, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Nelson Mandela are three. Mrs. Rosa Parks is another. Mrs. Parks was born in Tuskegee, Alabama in 1913. Much of her childhood was spent taking care of everyone because her mother and both grandparents were not in good health. She learned about the hardships of slavery and about emancipation from stories told by her maternal grandparents. From her family's teaching, her own observations as a child, and her experiences at the Montgomery Industrial School for Girls, she realized at an early age that segregation and discrimination were wrong. Later, she became a member of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, one of the first women to do so, and served as its secretary and youth advisor. She joined the Montgomery Voters League and encouraged blacks to register to vote. The modern civil rights movement was sparked when Mrs. Parks refused to surrender her seat on a bus to a white man on December 1st, 1995 in Montgomery, Alabama. 1955, thank you. Let's hope it's not 1995. I'm glad you're paying attention. Her arrest for violating the city's segregation laws was the catalyst for a mass boycott of the city's buses, whose ridership had been 70% black. That boycott brought Martin Luther King Jr. to national prominence as president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. The boycott continued until December 1956, when the U.S. Supreme Court declared the city's segregating seating laws to be unconstitutional. In the aftermath of the boycott, Mrs. Parks was unable to find employment in Montgomery, and she and her husband and mother then moved to Detroit. There, she continued her efforts to improve life for the black community, working with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In 1965, she became a staff assistant in the Detroit office of U.S. Representative John Conyers, serving until her retirement in 1988. Mrs. Parks has been called the First Lady of Civil Rights. She is the recipient of many awards, including the Martin Luther King Jr. Nonviolent Peace Prize and the Eleanor Roosevelt Women of Courage Award, and was one of 80 people to receive a Medal of Honor for her contributions to American ethnic diversity. In an interview with the Chicago Tribune, Rosa Parks articulated her personal creed: "I do the very best I can to look upon life with optimism and hope, and looking forward to a better day." We are privileged to have this symbol to America and the world for all those who love and cherish freedom, and we are privileged to have her with us. But there is one more thing I want to say, especially to our students that are here, about 1,500 of you in this gymnasium. This dialogue and this reunion of sorts between these three people and Mrs. Mobley is, in our view, an historical one, and you must pay attention to this moment. Sometimes in our lives, if we are lucky, We are privileged to be in the midst of something significant. Unfortunately, all too often, the meaning is either lost or unappreciated because we have not been fully present, we have not carefully listened, and we have not paid attention. And so we depend on our memory to give meaning to what we were a part of but did not really see. It is unlikely that Mrs. Parks and these two champions of human rights will be together again in a forum like this. Cherish this moment. Be grateful you are here today. Do not be distracted. Open before us is a window to our history. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Vernon Jarrett, Mr. Studs Terkel, and Mrs. Rosa Parks.
Very moving.
Now just think of it. 40 years ago, almost to the month, is when a working woman, a craftswoman, once upon a time, she was a remarkable seamstress, who became secretary to the chairman of the NAACP of Montgomery, Alabama, which was known as the cradle of the Confederacy. And there was an unwritten rule, it was there, it was in the books, that no African American, no matter what gender or what age, will be seated while a white person, no matter how young or vigorous, is standing. And on this one day, one time, one person, Mrs. Rosa Parks, decided it was enough. She sat down, and thus history was made. And I was thinking, Vern, as we're going to ask Mrs. Parks to speak of her life and what made her do it, thoughts come to your mind as we think of that moment.
The thing that comes to my mind is the same one that saturated all of my thoughts 20 years ago when I sat in your living room. You remember? Yes. I think it's on Virginia Street in Detroit.
Virginia Park.
Virginia Park. And I talked with you and your mother, Mrs. McCauley,
yes.
and of course, Raymond,
yes.
your late husband. You are such a quiet, soft, almost innocuous person.
That's a fooler.
This is what, if I were a white racist, this would frighten me out of my wits. Because if a quiet little woman like a seamstress named Rosa Parks could start a revolution, what would happen if the others spoke up? Here is what I would like for you to do for Studs and for me and for all of you. Who is Rosa Parks, this little quiet woman? When did you develop even the thought of defying the Jim Crow system of Alabama? Did someone plant you there? Did a committee say, Rosa, we want you to become a test case? Would you go and sit on the bus? Or was this the lone decision of one individual's soul and mind?
Well, it was my decision, and no one planted me, and no one told me to sit down on the bus and get arrested. In fact, I didn't leave home to get arrested. And of course, as far back as I can remember, even as a small child, my grandfather used to sit up all night with his gun to defy the Ku Klux Klan people if they should come into our house. And of course, I would sit with him and sit right on the floor with him while he did that. And there were times, of course, when we just didn't lie down and undress and lie down and go to bed because we didn't know when we would be invaded by the Klan people. And I think from that time, my earliest remembrance of things like that, and hearing my grandparents talk about how badly they were treated during the slavery days, because both of my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, were born in small children when they call it the Yankees came through. That is when they found out they were free after President Lincoln had signed the Proclamation for Freedom.
It can't be heard in the back. Is there a chance of the microphone being placed closer to Mrs. Parks?
I'm sorry you can't hear me, but I hope
How is
that
it
you
now?
can. Is it better? Thank you.
Could you
For-
sort of
for the-
recreate that briefly, what you just said that they didn't hear?
Oh,
that little
the-
background you were talking about.
The early in my life, I learned that about the Klans, Ku Klux Klan, and how they were going through the neighborhood, maybe burning churches and putting people to death, doing whatever they wanted to. And of course it created a lot of fear in the community. And my grandfather, who was quite old at that time, and also crippled, he would sit up in his rocking chair at night and not go to bed because he didn't know whether or not the Klans would invade our home. But he always said that he would get the first one who came in, and whatever else happened, he would take his stand. And this, of course, created in me a dislike of being treated in this manner because of our race and color. Everything was segregated, and of course we lived under the legally enforced racial segregation. And of course this people who was the power of people, the white people, believed very firmly that this would always be and would never end. And I was very anxious as a young person, along with my family, to hope one day that we would be free of that kind of treatment. And I joined the church very early, and we had a very spiritual home. And then, of course, it was the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was founded in Philadelphia by Richard Allen, who was a freed slave man who set himself free. I think he bought his freedom, but however, he was for freedom, and we used to enjoy going to what we call our evening on Sunday and study about Richard Allen. And to me, Richard Allen was just almost as important as Jesus Christ himself, because we just enjoyed knowing how he stood up against the white powers that be, even in Philadelphia, and founding our own church. And we, of course, I joined the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in the early 1940s, and worked as a secretary, and then we organized a youth council. And I enjoyed working with them as a senior advisor. And we, of course, we had the problem of getting registered to vote. And with Mr. E.D. Nixon and Attorney Arthur A. Madison, native of Montgomery, but he had gone to New York and was a lawyer. And so he came to help encourage people to get registered to vote. And in so doing, he was put in jail for that. And he was disbarred as a lawyer in the state of Alabama. So we had a lot of many trials and much opposition to on our way to freedom. But I felt that as long as there was any possible chance that we would be free, I would do my best to be a part of it.
I was thinking, Mrs. Parks, you notice one thing as Mrs. Parks was recounting the story of her individual life, she was recounting the story of the life of a whole people as well. See, in you, through the stories told by your grandparents and your parents and the others, older people, is this oral tradition, this history. So it isn't accidental that that day 40 years ago you decided it was enough.
No, it was not accidental. I just, when the driver told well, there were 4 people. I was sharing a seat with a man who was next to the window, and there were 2 women across the aisle. And when we rode, I think about 2 stops without being disturbed, a few more white people boarded the bus and took all the seats and left one man standing. And of course, the driver was the one who wanted him to take the seat. And in so doing, that meant that 4 of us would be standing and there'd be 3 vacant seats. Because their rule was that you could not share a seat with a white person or neither sit across from white passengers. And it was then that I told them, when I remained seated, the driver asked me if I was going to stand up, and I told him no, I wasn't. And he said he'd have me arrested if I didn't. And I told him he could do that. And that's
Mrs. Parks, I grew up in the South. I'm absolutely familiar with what you went through. But the thing that I always wanted to ask you directly, during that split second, which could have been an eternity in your life, when you knew what could have happened, including violence, including being slapped by that driver, including being shackled and thrown into a patrol wagon. I'm from the South, and I know my mother had to stand up 300 miles while there were vacant seats on a bus when they discovered that she was a Negro. So you must have contemplated for a moment the danger to your whole life. Could you give us a little profile of what went into your thinking and your feeling when you said no to Jim Crow?
Well, actually, I knew the possibilities of being hurt, either losing my life or whatever. But I felt so determined that I was willing to risk whatever happened to me to let it be known that we as a people had endured this kind of treatment far too long, and that I, as an individual, should not be treated in this manner.
Can I get it clear in my mind, but when you left the store where you had been working that day, that gray afternoon, to enter the Cleveland Avenue bus, you didn't contemplate this kind of showdown at all at that particular afternoon, evening?
No, I didn't. However, when I was confronted by this driver, I was very determined to let him know that it was wrong and that we should not be treated in this manner, and that the only way we could bring an end to this was to defy it, that kind of treatment. Because as we, for all those many years, had actually endured that treatment, those drivers who wanted to be very mean and overbearing were not treating us any better. Now, there were some drivers that did not interfere with people about standing up if a white person was standing. And there were some who just did their job and went on about their business. And there were some who didn't even want the African American passengers to go around to the back door to enter. I would like to say that in 1943, this same driver had evicted me from the bus because I got on and went and found a place to stand, and he wanted me to get off of the bus and to go back around to the back door to enter. So I told him that I was already on the bus and was not going around to the back door to get on again. And he told me if I couldn't ride his bus or do what he said, not to ride his bus. So I did get off the bus, and I think I either walked the rest of the way home or caught another bus. I don't remember. But then there were others who were the same way. They wouldn't want you to get on the bus unless you pass the fare to them and then find a way to get around to the back to enter. And when I refused to do that, so I missed riding some of the buses sometime, and then maybe somebody would pick me up and give me a ride in a car. I walked where I was going.
You are a symbol of something else to me that transcends color and even class. When the lone individual has to make a decision without consultation with anybody else. You made a decision. Did you look around to see if any of your friends were going to stand with you? How did the others react when you, this lone black woman, took this stand?
Well, no one spoke to me at all. And there were a number of African Americans who left the bus while the driver was going to find the police to have me arrested. And then while he was in the bus, some people did ask for a transfer to get on another bus, which he gave them. And
no one went over to you and said, "Sister Parks, what can we do?"
No one said anything to me at all about joining me.
How did the whites react who were witnessing this?
Well, they didn't have anything very much to say. They were very quiet. They talked among themselves a little bit, so I didn't pay any attention to what they were saying. There was no uprising or no loud talking on the bus.
Something happened, Mrs. Parks, at that moment, the climate. You seized the moment in history. Now, you are also working for a man named E.D. Nixon, a former Pullman car porter. We should point out Pullman car porters are the ones who brought the news from all over the world to the people in the South. E.D. Nixon had little education, But I know Vernon and I both met him, and he was a man of great eloquence. Did he play a role in your life, E.D. Nixon?
Well, yes, a friend of mine went to Mrs. Bertha Butler when somebody told her that I was arrested on the bus. She hurried around to his home, and he wasn't there, so his wife located him, and he called to find out if I was actually arrested on the bus, and the jailers wouldn't give him any answer. They told him it was none of his business. And he called Mr. Clifford Durr, who was a very liberal white attorney in Montgomery, and he called, and they acknowledged to Mr. Durr that he was that I was in jail. And then he got back in touch with Mr. Nixon, and Mr. and Mrs. Durr and Mr. Nixon went to the jail to have me released. And so that was how I was released from the jail after being there just a few hours.
Now, sorry, go ahead.
And when we went on back to the house, we began to discuss. Mr. Nixon seemed, he was concerned about having a test case. And so I told him that I would be willing if I thought it would do any good and we could do away with segregation on the buses. And my husband and mother agreed also. And that was why we actually started what we called our protest then. And on December the 5th, which was the following Monday morning, when I went to trial, and they found me guilty. And my case was appealed, and then we had Fred Gray, a young lawyer, and Charles Langford. They were two lawyers who were representing me.
Two distinguished black lawyers.
Yes, they were from Montgomery. And so after the Monday evening at the Holt Street Baptist Church, when there were so many people there that they couldn't get in the church, and they had to have speakers on the outside for those who couldn't get in to hear. That was when the people in Montgomery made a unanimous decision that we would all stay off the buses and wouldn't ride again until conditions were improved, and that people would not be, our people wouldn't have to be mistreated on the buses again.
Mrs. Parks, I recall a little bit, I'm getting kind of aged now, 20 years ago, you told me that there was a meeting in between that and the big rally, where you met at the Dexter Avenue, and that you had some reservations about that meeting.
The next meeting that we had was the evening after I was arrested, and I went over, I was told by Mr. Nixon to come over to the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, that they would have a meeting. So I asked him what the meeting was about. He said, about this thing. I know he meant about my being arrested. And we did have a meeting, and people did discuss some plans of what they hoped to do. However, I don't remember anything very decisive being made because it seemed that people just had to get themselves together to find out just what they would do. But they did call this meeting on Monday evening at the Holt Street Baptist Church, and the word had gotten out, and they had put an article in the paper that came out in the Sunday morning paper about.
That's the white newspaper?
Yes, about my being arrested. And there was one small article on the very next day after I was arrested. They said this Negro woman had overlooked her segregation. And then, of course, from one voice to the other, and over at the Alabama State College, Teachers College, there were some women who, Joanne Robinson, who was a teacher there, and she went to work. There's a group of women had banded together and was trying to do something about the segregation. So she made many leaflets about my being arrested. However, she didn't put my name on the leaflets. Just said I was the third one, because in March of 1955, a young girl, Claudette Colvin, was arrested and put in jail for not standing up on the bus.
So you were the third.
And then there was another young woman who was arrested, and I was the third person.
I was thinking, Mr. Parks, it's as though the whole black community of Montgomery and the Old South were waiting for this very act, for this very moment, the aftermath. Now, this is interesting. Perhaps you could recount that. Who traveled on the buses following your arrest and that big meeting at the church, the overflow meeting? How did the bus company do? How did people get to work?
Well, they went out of business. They didn't have enough patronage to stay in business, so they had to park the buses for quite a long time.
How did you feel, this one lonely person, when you saw the buses going down the street empty because your people had stood behind you, almost 99%?
I felt very good about it.
You know, there's one question that I think there may be some confusion over, is who actually organized the Montgomery bus boycott? Had you ever talked with Dr. King before that night at the Holt Street Church when the throng was there? I understand that you had a hard time getting in, and that Dr. King couldn't hardly get in the door himself because people didn't know him at that time.
Well, I did have a hard time getting in. However, I had met Dr. King in August of 1955 when he came to be a guest speaker at the NAACP meeting, but there was no mention of the buses at that time. Of course, he made a very good talk about the conditions of our community, and he had very good plans about doing something that would improve our way of life, because he was concerned about it. And so my arrest, and when he was on the same day I was on trial, was when they organized the Montgomery Improvement Association with the Reverend Abernathy. I think he was the one who named the organization, and they began to gravitate around that. And of course, the carpool was set up, and people were first the cab drivers were giving us rides, and the African American cab drivers, and the city threatened to revoke their license to drive the cabs. And then people who had cars just used their cars to give people rides. and we had the mass meetings at the various churches.
Do you remember those women who organized a group called the Club from Nowhere because they didn't want to call their names for fear that they get fired? So they called themselves the Women from Nowhere. You remember Ms. Gilmore?
Yeah, Miss Georgia Gilmore, and she lost her job because she was supporting our protest, and she started cooking and selling dinners at home, and she made much more money by just cooking it for other people and selling. Yeah. And by the way, her son is now on the city council in Montgomery. He's one of the council persons.
Mrs. Parks, you mentioned the white couple, Virginia and Clifford Durr, whom you knew, and he was the lawyer who helped you get off. Now, this couple, should point out to those who don't know, were known as premature integrationists, and there were very few in Montgomery, and they were, of course, attacked during the McCarthy days violently. Now, Mrs. Durr and Mr. Durr, did they represent a certain aspect of life in your life?
Yes, they were very good friends, and they were committed to be against racial segregation and discrimination. And for that, Mr. Durr lost much of his practice, and they were ostracized by the white community very much, to the extent that they had, I know one daughter, and maybe two, they had to send them north to school because the cheering white students would be so hostile towards them.
Well, they turned over Mrs. Durr's car, didn't they, and burned it. I think she said at one meeting that she attended.
I wouldn't be surprised. And we had, I don't know if it was Mrs. Durr, but there was a young Lutheran minister, Robert Gratz. I know they damaged his car very badly and put sugar in the tank and did something to the car and did a lot of things like that. And he suffered a lot too. He also wrote a book about his experiences as a white minister of a black congregation, and his house was bombed twice and once demolished, but he still had a lot of threats, but he stood his ground, and as long as he was in Montgomery, he worked with us.
And the reason I raised the question about the Durrs is that all this that you knew in your life and experienced led up to that moment on the bus. The Durrs, and also we know we're at a school that's very exciting here. The school itself is a very exciting one to the students. You went to a school later on, attended one for adults, where they're working people called Highlander School in Tennessee. That play a role in your life?
Smoky Mountain.
Oh yes, that was in Mount Eagle, Tennessee, and that was in the summer of 1955 in July. And
was Dr. King there also?
He, not at that time, but he did come over later and make a speech there, and they accused him of being communist. Miles Hardin, of course, was the man who founded the Highlander Folk School, and it was founded to help the people who, especially people who were in unions, more like a labor school. But he didn't have any segregation at all at his place either. And he also was, well, he had to leave there because they burned down the main house, the main building, and he was put in jail. And so there was Septima Clark, who was one of the
Septima Clark.
Yes, she was one of the persons who worked at Highlander, and they put her in jail too. So she really had a hard time because she was for freedom and equality and people getting registered. And the reason she went to Highlander is because she was fired from her job as a teacher in Charleston, South Carolina.
Ms. Parks, everybody knows that you ignited a movement that shocked not only the South and the North, but the world. And I think that has to sink in at some point. 381 days of a boycott in the deep Confederate South, in a population of close to 40,000 black people who were dependent upon white people for survival. I'd like for you to, as best you can, to try to describe the frame of mind of a house servant who has to go to work and wait in the white folks' kitchen, and the white people thought they were satisfied until they discovered that these people had refused to ride the bus. Did you have any friends who shocked themselves by their own courage?
Yes, I knew a number of them who just went right on and stayed right with the bus protest and did not give in. There was a little story that was told by one woman, and the husband fired the cook, and when his wife got there, she wanted to know where she was, and he told her he fired her. And she told him, he said, "You better go back and get her, and you can bring her back here, else you better go too. You have to go too."
On that point, Vernon, you notice your reaction, laughter. Laughter, humor through adversity is one of the attributes of African Americans, Vernon. The idea of certain moments of laughter erupt in the middle of crisis. You're laughing to keep...
I guess so.
Isn't that, Vernon?
This is what Mrs. Gilmore, the woman who got fired and started her own kitchen in her house. I ate dinner in her house, incidentally. She had a you'd have to stand in line. You'd have to stand in line at least 15 or 20 years ago to eat at Mrs. Gilmore's house. And she was in the kitchen, and everybody was walking in, getting cornbread and black-eyed peas and serving themselves. But she told me that there was never a meeting, one of those weekly meetings, that it wasn't saturated with spies and agents taking notes on what black people were there. What kind of feeling did that ignite among those people, that they just continued to hold out, knowing their names were being taken down? And remember, McCarthy was coming up. How did you feel not knowing when your home is going to be bombed?
Well, we just went on, and I think kept our trust in the Lord and prayed and sang and stayed together in spite of the threats, what might have been a disaster.
Do you
And
recall when
people
Dr.
did
King's
suffer.
home was bombed?
Yes, I do. And Mr. Nixon.
His home? And then the minister you spoke of?
Yes, Robert Grant.
Did you ever say, I wonder when are they going to bomb Rosa Parks' home and Raymond Parks?
Well, we were fortunate. Of course, at that time we were living in an apartment in the projects, and they didn't know where we were. I guess.
You mentioned praying, the role of the church. Now we come to this, and the whole civil rights movement. The role of the church, I assume, was an essential one, wasn't it, in your life and that of...
Oh, yes, it was very important, because they had the meetings where they would sing and pray and get our news of what was going on in the neighborhood because the white newspapers were very much against our protest.
I understand that the white newspaper actually made a success out of the first day, that if they hadn't printed the ridiculous idea of these Negroes thinking they can boycott a bus company, they put it in the paper, and this is how people found out you had a bus boycott.
That's right.
Yeah. But on that point, getting to work, you know, the buses were empty, absolutely worked. So remember Dr. King and his wife were peering out the window one day, what's going to happen? Empty buses. Now would they pooled carpools? And there were some white women too, were there not, who, friends of Virginia Dare, who came through with cars. Very few,
yes,
of course.
there were some who did that, and of course they would annoy the Mayor Gale at that time, and when he would talk against them picking up their household help, and they would say if he was willing
The mayor's
to
help was joining in on the boycott.
not his help, but other people. I don't know who worked for him. She might have joined too. But anyway, they just made the protest permanent. They meant for it to be as long as they had segregation, because the mayor and the white officials wanted us to return to the buses under the same conditions that we had been experiencing. And when we wouldn't do that, of course, there were a lot of threats. People were arrested for almost nothing and had to just endure it.
Your old friend, the late E.D. Nixon, told me that one of the most unforgettable aspects of that boycott was that not only did blacks shock white America, but they rediscovered themselves, their own power. Now, you don't have to agree to this next statement. He said that prior to the boycott, most of the ministers might be considered Uncle Toms. And then they discovered the power of themselves and the church, and that's what made that boycott last for 381 days, unprecedented in the history of any movement, 381 days. Did you rediscover something in Rosa Parks?
Well, I was very glad that the people had cooperated with each other and was willing to continue the protest and boycott until the United States Supreme Court ruled racial segregation in transportation was unconstitutional. And of course we had problems after that too, afterwards, but then finally we reached the point that there would be no more going back to where we were.
You know what you're saying now? This probably is as good a spot as any. Mrs. Parks is having an arduous tour, and we have a story here of revelation. Vern asked you this last question. It's really about revelation of your own self, you and your people, and discovery. In a sense, that's what the story is about. It's about Rosa Parks' story is about all of us, really. Revelation is something within us not yet tapped. It was tapped here in her, and her story is ours as well, possibly. And I think this is a way of thanking Mrs. Parks for her memorable life and story.
So the next time you see the University of Alabama playing the University of Mississippi in football, and it looks as though it was Tuskegee versus Wilberforce, give her a salute. Thank you. No, we salute you.
You can stand up. Thank you. Thank
We
you
love
very
you.
much. I would have liked to see the audience, but they have them in the shadow, so I can't see who.
She says she'd like to see the audience. Would somebody turn on the light so she can see who's applauding her? This is just wonderful.